Hi, this is Dr. Wooler for Integrative Medicine Academy for Great Plains Laboratory. This is another monthly webinar for me, sponsored by Great Plains Lab. We certainly want to put a shout out to them for sponsoring these free webinars now for many years. So I'm sure some of you have heard me before. If this is your first time, well, I hope you enjoy the content. I thought I would round out my webinar, this is my last webinar of 2019, and talk a little bit about cholesterol and cholesterol deficiencies here. So I'm Dr. Kurt Wooler. I've been an integrative and functional medicine physician for over 20 years, working a lot with the autism community, working with people with autoimmune diseases, gastrointestinal and neurological problems. I do a lot of speaking for Great Plains through their GPL Academy. So I teach their entire organic acid test seminar. I speak at their Integrative Medicine for Mental Health Conference. It's not theirs, but they're associated with it. I've been doing these webinars for years, and I also do a lot of my own education. I'm the co-founder of an online academy called Integrative Medicine Academy, where we teach courses in integrative medicine on various topics. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. So let's talk a little bit about cholesterol, low cholesterol. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that this discussion really isn't cut and dry. When you're talking about cholesterol, high, low, normal, there's a lot of moving parts. And so, you know, the information in this presentation, and if you think about information on all aspects of low cholesterol, it's just not absolute. Neither is it on high cholesterol. There's many variables, okay, that determine cholesterol levels. That can be genetics, that can be diet, liver and digestive function, absorption of nutrients from the gut, types of fats that are being eaten, and other nutrients. So manganese, for example, can play a role in low cholesterol. So I want you to keep that in mind, that even when cholesterol supplementation is being used, sometimes the levels don't go up or don't go up appreciably. So again, it's not a straightforward discussion, but it's an interesting one to have because it plays an important role in all of our health. So some of the functions of cholesterol is that it helps to maintain the cell membranes of our body, including our nervous system. So membrane fluidity, permeability, stabilization of our cell membranes helps the cells resist against rapid changes in temperature. It makes up the myelin that protects our nerve cells in the brain nervous system. And then I've got a couple arrows here pointing at a few things I want to highlight. Cholesterol being linked to vitamin D, cholesterol being linked to absorption of fat-soluble vitamins, for example, through bile acids. And cholesterol is linked to steroid hormones and sex hormones. So it plays a role in all of that. So cholesterol essentially has its hands in many things biochemically in the body. Steroid hormones, as I mentioned before, bile salts. And it's interesting, it's involved in this protein called sonic hedgehog. Sonic hedgehog is a protein that's involved in embryological development, and specifically when sonic hedgehog is not activated appropriately, we can run into problems of digit formation problems in a child. So it's kind of interesting. This is your steroidal hormone principal pathways. If you look at this slide, we've got pregnenolone, we've got progesterone, cortisol, estradiol, testosterone, DHEA. And there's all, any of these pathways move back and forth, but the bottom line is that they all are derived from a baseline level of cholesterol. So cholesterol is part of the steroidal hormone pathways for all of these hormones. Cholesterol helps to form bile salts. Bile salts are necessary to digest fats in the small intestine. Bile salts also play a role in helping to stimulate what's called the migrating motor complex, which is part of the myoelectric system that makes up our small intestine. So people who have deficiencies in migrating motor complex activity are oftentimes at an increased risk for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It's interesting that bile acids also stimulate the pancreas to release their digestive enzymes, and bile acids also have a stimulating effect to some degree. Most of them are reabsorbed from the last part of the small intestine, but bile acids can also have a stimulating effect on contractility and peristaltic activity within the large intestine. And so it's well known the consequences of high cholesterol, but even this slide doesn't completely describe the link to coronary heart disease, and that in itself is a complicated discussion, the plaque formation that can occur from high cholesterol. Whether it's carotid artery disease, peripheral arterial disease, or coronary heart disease, we know that high cholesterol can be associated with it, but there's other factors too, like chronic inflammation that would certainly increase the chances. But what does high cholesterol really mean? Because total cholesterol is not just one thing, it is a combination of things. The value of total cholesterol is made up of HDL, LDL, and triglycerides. And so if we look at a standard lipid panel, triglycerides are often listed. Triglycerides travel in the bloodstream with cholesterol. They provide the fatty acid substrate that we need for energy production at the cellular level. And so usually if you're seeing high triglycerides, for example, there's poor utilization or perhaps overproduction or overconsumption of those. Diabetes, insulin resistance, excess sugar consumption, for example, are reasons for high triglycerides, alcohol consumption too. And sometimes people are low in triglycerides from either malabsorption, vegetarian diets, eating a low-fat diet, for example, could be a contributing factor, and there's others. Often HDLs are listed as the good cholesterol. And the primary reason for that is that their role is to help transport cholesterol back to the liver, where it gets metabolized in part into bile acids. And the general feeling for a long time is that if your total cholesterol was high, but the HDL was also high, and your LDL, the low density, is low, well, that scenario seems to be more protective against atherosclerosis. High cholesterol, low HDL is seen as a greater risk predictor of coronary artery disease. At least that's been what has been looked at from a conventional medical standpoint for years. Now, HDL deficiencies can exist again in malabsorption problems or liver dysfunction, diabetes, genetics, even lack of exercise might explain it in some. And then comes the low density lipoprotein, the LDL. So generally, the general feeling is that as LDL levels increase, the HDL levels can decrease. And that in itself would then be a risk factor for atherosclerosis. But we know, again, right, there's inflammatory components that can be involved as well. And usually, LDL levels will go up with, again, things that will generally drive up triglycerides. So excess sugar, insulin resistance, alcohol, eating a lot of refined carbohydrates, for example, which is going to have more of an effect on triglyceride, but the saturated fats will tend to cause the LDL levels to go up. And then, of course, the same reasons it could be low would be things like malabsorption and liver, problems. But there's another aspect of LDL that often doesn't get discussed, and that's something called small dense LDL cholesterol. This was an article that just came out earlier this year, looking at small dense LDL cholesterol associated with metabolic syndrome, and oftentimes will be a causative factor for inflammatory reactions within the blood vessels. And so there's different sizes to low density lipoprotein. So generally what's being measured in the blood in a common blood test is a general LDL cholesterol. But what isn't being measured is these small, dense LDLs. And it's really the small, dense LDLs that seem to be sort of make up the bad component of LDL cholesterol in general. So in just looking at LDL, it doesn't tell us the full story. This actually comes from a website called liposearch.com, or and so they've got a number of different, articles and information. But here we can see these small, dense LDLs have the ability. Let me get a different color pen. Have the ability to cross through, or the smooth cell of the blood vessel, right? And they get into the smooth muscle and they cause oxidative reactions. And then we get part of the immune system that gets involved to try to deal with these inflammatory small dense LDLs. And that's what causes this foam cell to accumulate. And that's what essentially leads to the atheroma, or the accumulation of this clotting type of substance. Whereas the regular LDL, okay, the normal size LDL, what's called a medium LDL, it's too large, right? It can't pass through that endothelium space. But these smaller, small dense lipoproteins can. Okay, those are what pass through and then trigger the inflammation. So again, just looking at LDL doesn't really tell us the whole story. And so small dense LDL cholesterol, okay, have a strong association with heart disease, particularly when triglycerides are high. Now, small dense LDLs are felt to be created in excess states of carbohydrate consumption, particularly refined foods, a lot of sugar, typical American diet, eating a lot of fast food, high sugar consumption. Whereas saturated fats, okay, like coconut oil, grass-fed beef, those definitely can raise LDL cholesterol. They also can raise HDL, but they generally tend to improve the quality of the LDLs, meaning less small, dense LDL. So your LDL goes up, but it's the larger kind, right? The kind that generally can't pass through the lining of the endothelium and trigger inflammation of the smooth muscle. And countries that usually consume high amounts of coconut oil, so a lot of, I'm trying to think, like, South Pacific Island nations, for example, that consume a lot of coconut oil, even though it's a saturated fat, generally have low rates of heart disease. So coconut oil can definitely raise HDL, okay? It can definitely raise LDL, but again, it's raising the sort of the good component of the LDL, and it will have a lowering effect on triglycerides. Fortunately, it helps to lower these small dense LDL, or types of LDL cholesterol. And so when you're looking at a total cholesterol number, again, it's not just one thing. So we know that cholesterol it helps to make up and form the cell membranes of the body. It helps with bile acid formation. It's involved in sex and steroid hormone production. But the calculation is important to recognize. Okay, so the typical calculation for total cholesterol is LDL plus HDL plus, in parentheses, triglyceride divided by 5. And again, we talked about some of the things that can either raise each one of these components. So, low thyroid function, liver dysfunction, insulin resistance, typical Western diet, high carbs will increase generally total cholesterol, or can. And what can decrease it is malabsorption and hyperthyroidism, poor absorption. Manganese deficiency, kind of interesting, is linked to low cholesterol. So here's a blood panel. So we got a total cholesterol of 194. And here's a way that you can do a calculation. It breaks down the triglycerides, HDL, LDL. Okay, so if we took this calculation of total cholesterol, so we've got our triglycerides 36 divided by 5. And so if you remember what is it called? PEMDAS, I think it is. I vaguely remember this from high school. See if I could even remember this. So we do parentheses first, then exponents, then you multiply, then you divide, then you add, then you subtract, in that order. So in this example, we're doing the parentheses first. So 36 divided by 5 is 7. And then we just do simple addition. Okay, 101, 86, 7 equals 194. So that equals that value right there. Here's somebody with low cholesterol at 98. So clearly they could definitely need to raise their cholesterol levels. Our triglycerides, okay, are actually within a somewhat normal range. Our total cholesterol is low. We'll talk about that here shortly. Our HDLs are low, okay, and our LDLs, now according to conventional, literature, would be considered ideal, being less than 100. But again, our total, it's the total cholesterol. But again, it's trying to understand, well, what's low, what's normal, and what might actually be slightly high. In this particular person, everything's pretty much low. Okay, so our simple calculation is LDL, triglyceride divided by 5. So 90 divided by 5 gives us 18 plus 34 plus 46 equals 98. So the numbers don't necessarily tell us what's going on. So what are some problems or associated with cholesterol? And then we'll look at some reasons why it might be low a little bit deeper. Well, from a risk standpoint, okay, there's a lot of different types of problems that can happen in people with low cholesterol. That doesn't mean that everybody with low cholesterol will get these problems or all of these issues. But there's an increased risk for these things within the given population. So let's look at a couple scenarios here, from anxiety problems to violent behavior to school suspensions to even difficult time getting rid of drug addiction, which is kind of interesting. This was a paper that came out in the early 90s talking about the association of low cholesterol to serotonin levels. They were looking at monkeys that consumed a low cholesterol diet, and they generally tend to be more aggressive and less social. And what they also found was that their serotonin metabolite marker was called 5-HAA, something measurable off the organic acid test, was also lower in these animals who had the lower levels of cholesterol. This was an article looking at school suspensions in a group of kids. The kids that had lower levels of cholesterol, the cutoff in this test was the study was 145 milligrams per deciliter. Those less than that had a threefold increase of school suspension or being expelled versus kids with higher levels. Suicide. Okay, this was a paper looking at the association between low cholesterol, depression, and the potential for suicide. So in this particular study, these were hospitalized patients. Those with lower levels of total cholesterol had a higher propensity for suicide or attempted suicide. Drug addiction. This was a paper looking at relapse in cocaine addicts. So again, significant lower levels in patients who tended to have a greater propensity to relapse, whether they were looked at 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months after being discharged from a treatment facility. So if you're working with patients with drug addiction, check their total cholesterol levels. Okay, this particular one was looking at heroin addicts, kind of the same thing. So as the cocaine addicts, you would expect that lower cholesterol levels in these individuals showed a more difficult time in getting over their heroin addiction. And that's obviously not an easy thing to overcome anyway, but having low cholesterol certainly doesn't help. And then there's some immune system factors involved with cholesterol. This particular paper was from many years ago that was looking at LDL cholesterol, right? The so-called bad cholesterol. Well, it actually has a protective effect against infections. And it's probably, if we were to break this down, it's more of the medium-sized LDL, maybe not the small dense LDL, because we know that form of LDL can trigger inflammation. So it's probably more of just the medium LDL, the normal one. And so LDL was actually found to have a protective effect against red blood cells, okay, particularly when there is some kind of bacterial endotoxin being produced. So lower levels of cholesterol or total cholesterol, which will very likely include the LDL cholesterol, could increase the potential for, I guess you should say, it could at least somewhat compromise the immune system. This one's interesting to me. This was actually a paper looking at cholesterol and serotonin receptors. We know that serotonin is that feel-good neurochemical. It's involved in helping with depression and limiting anxiety, etc. What this paper was talking about was that cholesterol binds to the serotonin 1A receptors, and in this particular case, found within the hippocampus. The hippocampus is part of the brain that's involved in emotional control, emotional memory, for example. Problems of the hippocampus can increase anxiety, increase aggression, increase panic. But there's serotonin receptors throughout the brain. So these things play a role in brain function, regulating temperature control, sleep, okay, mediated by cholesterol. Which brings us to oxytocin, because there's actually a relationship between serotonin and oxytocin, and an overlap within these systems. It's complicated, but there is a communication network between the serotonin system as well as the oxytocin system. And oxytocin, we know, is that bonding hormone. It's a hormone that's released during bonding, so between mother and child during breastfeeding. It helps with milk letdown. It also helps with cervical effacement and uterine contractions during delivery. It helps to increase feelings of trust, bonding, pleasure. It's released in sexual intercourse. Even hugging somebody, you get a release of oxytocin. One of the things that happens when people are deficient, or at least I should say probably more like kids, autistic kids who tend to be deficient in oxytocin, is there is a increased problem in facial emotional recognition or just facial expression recognition. Well, it turns out that cholesterol has a binding effect on oxytocin receptors. So what that means is that cholesterol helps to stabilize the oxytocin receptor. When you stabilize a receptor, it allows for greater binding to whatever that substrate is going to be that's going to bind to it. In this particular case, it's oxytocin. And it also improves the function of the oxytocin receptor. And it delays the inactivation of the oxytocin receptor. So basically, it helps the oxytocin receptor just function better. So what are some potential causes of low cholesterol? Well, we talked about some of them before: malnutrition, malabsorption, liver disease, hyperthyroidism, chronic gastrointestinal infections. Okay, it could be a contributing factor. Manganese deficiency, and I don't have the exact data on this, but manganese deficiencies is a potential cause. There's a genetic disorder called SLOS. And then iron excess, a condition called hemochromatosis, which affects more than 1 million people in the United States. It's an iron overload condition where people absorb too much iron. That can have a negative effect on total cholesterol. So what are some labs that you should consider when cholesterol levels are low? Well, clearly you want to look at standard blood testing. So look at the liver panel, look at your protein globulins, look at those protein factors, make sure there's just not some kind of deficiency state or absorption issue. I'll talk here about iron and TIBC shortly. Thyroid test, doing a comprehensive thyroid test would be important. Hair mineral analysis, Great Plains carries that. That's the hair metals test. Do a stool test. Look for digestive function and inflammation, infections, and then never pass on the organic acid test. Okay, that's a must test in my experience and my view to not pass on. Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome, this is a genetic disorder where people lack this converting enzyme called 7-dihydrocholesterol reductase. Not real common, it's pretty rare. Some of these kids actually have very, very low levels of cholesterol. One of the telltale issues of SLOS is this Y-shaped toe between the second and third toe. And some of these kids manifest as autistic. They have a lot of behavioral problems, self-mutilation, hyperactivity. So it's something to consider because in autism, low cholesterol can be found, and it could be a contributing factor to these problems too, even though they don't necessarily have this SLOS condition. Right, so here we have that block between dihydrocholesterol and cholesterol. We know that cholesterol is involved in vitamin D and these other factors that we talked about earlier. And so here in the US, we use the milligrams per deciliter unit measurement for cholesterol. Other countries internationally, they use the millimole per liter. So we're looking for a cholesterol of at least 160 milligrams per deciliter, and I think millimoles per liter, what is that, 4.14, something like that. And this was just a paper talking about how the National Institutes of Health has even come out with information about low cholesterol having an increased association with depression, anxiety, bipolar, neurological problems, behavioral issues. One of the things that's seen in SLOS kids is the lower levels of cholesterol, generally the worse symptoms they have. And for a lot of these kids, it's problems in behavior issues. So head banging, tactile defensiveness, poor muscle tone, decreased sociability. And one of the things that's often seen when these kids get cholesterol, usually through eggs or some other food, is there's often improvement in these conditions. Well, the same thing can apply for other people, and one of the groups is the autistic kids. Sometimes I've actually seen improvements in socialization, improvements in behavior, less defensiveness, less aggression by giving cholesterol supplementation. Now, hemochromatosis is an iron disorder in which the body basically loads too much iron. So people absorb too much iron. They figure about somebody with hemochromatosis absorbs about 4 times more iron than normal. Okay, you can learn more about hemochromatosis you go to hemochromatosis.org. And it's more common than people realize. And it's fairly easy to assess, at least from an iron overload status, not hemochromatosis. To get that diagnosis, you need specialized genetic testing. But you can look at iron overload through 2 simple markers. One is serum iron. So increased levels would be seen in things like liver disease or excessive intake, for example, certainly hemochromatosis. Decreased levels would be, again, bleeding problems or poor intake, and you combine that with the total iron binding capacity. A lot of people do the serum ferritin because they think that that's going to be more direct measurement of iron status. Serum ferritin is important, but ferritin levels can be influenced by inflammation. Ferritin is the storage form of iron, but it in really high levels certainly can be associated with iron excess. But to the early phase measurement of iron overload really is done through serum iron and total iron binding capacity. Total iron binding capacity is an approximation measurement of a protein called transferrin. This is a serum protein that binds to iron. It makes up about binding capacity of about 70%. There's some other things that bind iron, but for the most part, it's transferrin. So when there is an iron deficiency, total iron binding capacity levels will increase. When there's an iron overload, total iron binding capacity decreases. And so the calculation is your serum iron divided by your total iron binding capacity. And the general feeling is that, well, it's variable. There's different things. If you have an iron, what's called a percent saturation. So if you take your serum iron and you divide it by your total iron binding capacity and then multiply that by 100, the level is at 65 or greater. That's very suggestive of hemochromatosis and very likely iron overload. There's some sources that say levels at even 45%. A percent saturation would be suggestive of iron overload. Most of the reference ranges I've seen from the labs have a cutoff of about 50. So again, serum iron divided by total iron binding capacity multiplied by 100 gives you your percent saturation. Well, what are some ways that we can increase cholesterol? Well, we certainly can increase it through diet. So eggs tend to be high in cholesterol. Brain is high in cholesterol. Liver is another source of cholesterol. Not that many people here in the US are eating brain, but that you can get, liver from most health food stores. But remember the calculation, right? So we've got LDL, HDL, and then triglyceride. So there's some other ways that we can work to try to, improve cholesterol status. We certainly, obviously, eating those foods. We can try and raise triglycerides. Well, this would, incorporate more carbohydrate consumption, consuming more saturated fats, consuming more full fat, not daily products. That's a typo. Dairy products. Okay, so that might help. Even small amounts of alcohol can increase triglycerides. Medium chain triglyceride oil is debatable. It's not, from what I researched, is not conclusive. Some research says it lowers it. Some research says it actually increases it. So it's hard to say. And then, of course, medium chain triglyceride oil is linked to coconut oil. We can try and raise our HDLs. Olive oil can be helpful. Regular exercise. Coconut oil, we know, can raise HDLs. Eating purple produce, blackberries, red cabbage, purple corn was a resource I saw for that as well. And then we can try and raise our LDL, more saturated fats, for example. Coconut oil. Consume full fat dairy. I actually spelled it right there. So again, think about other ways if you're trying to manipulate the mathematical equation. So HDL, LDL plus triglycerides. The other thing too is if you do additional testing, you might have absorption problems. So digestive enzymes could be helpful. The incorporation of digestive enzymes that might have lipase as part of it to help with fat digestion. If there's chronic infections in the gut, those need to be worked on. If there's a manganese deficiency that's picked up off of a hair metal analysis, that can be incorporated. So again, diet certainly helps, but there may be other factors that are going on that need to be investigated. From a supplement standpoint, sonic cholesterol, this comes from New Beginnings Nutritionals, can be very helpful. Okay, it's hypoallergenic, so people with egg allergy can consume these. One capsule is equivalent to about 1 large egg. This can be quite effective. Easily absorbed, doesn't have much taste, can easily be mixed into food, for example. And the general dosing recommendations on these, at least from an initial standpoint of introducing it, the general feeling is you use 1 capsule for every 10 points less than 160. So if our target level was 160 on our US units at milligrams per deciliter, if you're sitting at 150, you use 1 capsule. If you're sitting at 100, well, 160 minus 100 is 60 divided by 10, that would be 6. Okay, so 6 capsules. But those are just sort of general starting rules. Some people need more, some people need less. That is to be determined upon retesting. And retesting of your cholesterol levels is a good idea. I think probably every 90 days or so is very reasonable. But the reality is, in practice, is that sometimes even sonic cholesterol doesn't automatically raise the cholesterol numbers appreciably. You may see clinical benefit in that a person is more stable emotionally. If it's an autistic child, they may be more social, they're less irritable, there's better cognitive abilities, but you may not see a dramatic shift in the blood levels. And that's just kind of the mystery of all this, to be honest with you. And that's why my opening slide to this talk was the information on this it's not absolute. It's not cut or dry. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot that we do know, and there's, in many regards, some things we just don't know because it's variable for different types of people. But you can do a lot of good by using things like sonic, working on diet, and working on other factors of digestive health to try to improve the situation. And like a lot of things in medicine, there's obviously more to be learned and more to the story. A couple things you can consider from Great Plains Lab as far as some additional testing they have is to do their advanced cholesterol profile. They look at total cholesterol. They also look at these other lipoproteins, A1, B, lipoprotein A, which are associated with transportation of fat or different fats throughout the body. So that's it. This is a blood test, by the way, the advanced cholesterol panel. If there's a concern of iron overload, you can do their total iron binding capacity test, another blood test. This gives us that percent saturation equation to see if we're dealing with an iron overload condition. A heavy metal analysis gives us an assessment of metals for one, but also certain minerals like manganese. So if manganese is deficient, for example, that could be a contributing factor. The organic acid test, you bet, because it's going to look at bacteria and yeast. Do a stool analysis. Okay, comprehensive stool test to look for other infections, parasites, bacterial imbalances, digestive marker problems, etc. So these would all be complementary tests to consider doing. Website called Lab Test Plus offers a lot of these tests. Now, the Lab Test Plus website offers many tests from Great Plains Lab. It does not provide access to blood testing, but finger prick tests like the food IgG, urine tests like the organic acid test, stool testing, hair testing are available through Lab Test Plus. And when a lab is ordered through Lab Test Plus, it comes with a written interpretation of the relevant markers and then what are called action step suggestions. So for more information on tests from Lab Test Plus, you can go to labtestplus.com, or you can email to labtestplus@gmail.com. If you are a parent or a caregiver of an individual with autism and you have questions for me, please feel free to reach out to me through autismrecoverysystem.com. This is a comprehensive biomedical education website with course material, with videos, with webinar recordings, as well as an interactive parent forum where you can dialogue with me about your child on a daily basis if you'd like to. If you are a practitioner looking to incorporate organic acids testing and other labs from Great Plains Lab, join us at one of the GPL Academy events. There's many coming up in 2020. You can go to GPL Workshops, gplworkshops.com, for a complete list of upcoming GPL Academy events, and I speak at most of them. I also have my own online academy. Okay, so Integrative Medicine Academy has been around for about 4 years, and we have many different courses, actually more than I have listed here. We have an autism mastery course that's starting again in January of 2020. It's the most comprehensive biomedical course for autism. We'll be restarting our toxicity and our SIBO mastery courses here soon. And then we currently are adding what's called an essential oat organic acid course. And we have an advanced organic acid as well as a functional medicine course. You can go to integrativemedicineacademy.com for more information about our online courses. Through our practice, both myself and my partner, Dr. Trancatella, have a health practitioner consultation service. So if you are a healthcare practitioner and you are wanting some assistance on lab test interpretation, on clinical correlation, on troubleshooting different difficult cases, you can reach out to us through this mentoring program. Okay, so we actually have a section on our website at mysunrisecenter.com. You can also email to scmedicalcenter@gmail.com. And then if you're wishing to consult with me privately, okay, if you're, again, a parent of a autistic child, individual, or somebody else who's wanting to discuss things about gut problems or autoimmune conditions and you want to consult with me privately, you can reach out to me through the same email, same website. mysunrisecenter.com is our practice website, and the email address is scmedicalcenter@gmail.com. So I hope that information was helpful for you, interesting. You know, there's always more to discuss, and fortunately we have more webinars coming up in 2020. So I want to wish everybody happy holidays. I hope you have a happy, safe holiday with your family, no matter where you are here, whether it's in the US or internationally. Be safe. Look forward to seeing you all back for more Great Plains sponsored webinars in 2020 and beyond. So everybody stay safe, stay well. This is Dr. Kurt Wooler for Great Plains Laboratory Webinars. Thanks so much. Take care.